Baik saya mengasihkan. Terima kasih banyak. Hello, my name is Robert Pembroke. I'd like to tell you a joke today. It's kind of like an ironic joke. It's a bittersweet joke. It's one of those millenarian jokes that's culturally reproduced time and time again. It's known variously as the scapegoat joke, the diaspora joke. Often people think of it in relation to acts of genocide. It goes something like this. It's a bit of a riddle, really. It says, how much does a Holocaust? And what is a Holocaust? Yeah? And it relates to the idea of a funeral. How much does it cost to have a funeral? How much does a Holocaust? And what is a Holocaust, or what is a genocide? Yeah, so it's a microcosm of thought about the cost of a funeral, and it's a macrocosmic thought about the cost of genocide, the killing of millions of people. And it's one of these answers, this riddle. It has one of these strange answers that amounts to the same thing. I'll get to the answer to this joke later. As I say, it's quite millenarian. It's culturally reproduced at historically specific points in time, because it tends to recur, this sort of stuff. Now I'll take you first to the work of Anne Frank in the Diary of Anne Frank, and I'd like you to sort of suspend your belief for a moment about whether or not Anne Frank even existed, and think about it as being not dissimilar to the Hitler diaries, because they were proven to be false. Now, my concern about the authenticity of the Diary of Anne Frank was that even though she was frank, in that she was sincere, it sounded a bit like a surname joke, didn't it? Because your name's Anne Frank and you're sincere. Yeah, you're kind of honest about things. You're savagely honest about a terrible thing in history, aren't you? If you're Anne Frank, because that's exactly what her biography was about. But there was a problem with the wordage in her biography. It was just a bit too good, and it for a little girl, it's quite an elaborate speech pattern. Even the director, Steven Spielberg, I think, would probably say such. And he, of course, directed the famous novel that became a film known as Schindlers List. So, even though he wasn't, well, he is an advocate of the need to protect marginalised ethnicities from scapegoating that leads to a diaspora, as occurred and ended in the Holocaust in Germany in World War II, after World War II as well. He was aware that there are contrivances that lead to a plethora of inconsistencies in the way the character of Anne Frank phrased and spelled her words in the German language. She seemed a bit too good for a little girl, It's strange, eh? Now, I stopped short of suggesting that the diary of Anne Frank is an American forgery, like some have said in relation to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Once again, there's a lot of people who say that they're fraudulent artefacts. And the reason they say that in relation to the Dead Sea Scrolls is because the parchment is a skin, a ram's skin, like a sheep's skin, yeah? And it's a bit too good, isn't it? It lasted a bit too long. And the only way you could achieve that, and I'm not saying you could get there with it, would be to place something in a vacuum for thousands of years. So it's not likely to occur, is it? And a lot of people think that perhaps the Dead Sea Scrolls was some sort of imagining of 19th century forgers. possibly around 1851 with the Crystal Palace exhibition. And it was similar to the fraudulent activities of confidence tricksters at that time, well later than that, towards the latter part of the 19th century, near the 20th century, where there were these tricksters who stole corpses from graveyards in Europe and sort of rebirthed them as Egyptian mummies. And then they pulverised these mummies they bandaged up and showed people they were turning it into a type of powdered concoction for the genteel people of Victorian society, who were promised by these wagon show people that, you know, this pulverised corpse powder was actually the elixir of life. It was a type of fountain of youth, and it was often marketed by these exuberant, wild-billed hiccup types, not averse to selling whiskey from the back of a wagon type of person, yeah? So I'm thinking the claim about at least the Dead Sea Scrolls is not dissimilar to suggestions that the Shroud of Turin is a faithful blood and sweat portraiture of Jesu. Once again, even for something that's not more than 150 years old, that's a pretty good fabric to last that long, a natural fabric. So I think we can safely say that's not the fair dinkum stuff either. I'm inclined to think that these ways of thinking, they're the work of confidence tricksters who've designed a consumer market principle on the basis of an enchantment with magical thinking that appeals to these Oscar Wilde gay alters, these characters like Dorian Gray with promises of eternal youth. It relates also to the work of Holocaust deniers, because there's kind of like a finality, a terminability to it all, isn't there? Once we start to analyse these things, we see a finality to it all, don't we? Now, I think about, when I think of the deniers, the Holocaust deniers, I think of, let me see, the work of Mr David Irving, the historian. I actually think he writes his histories quite nicely, you know, despite the contentiousness of it all. I'm thinking that Mr David, Hogan's heroes, Irving, would have gained greater traction if he had taken a more holistic view of the clash between historiography and the contrivances of confidence tricksters. If he had seen the birth of Holocaust denial histories at a point further back in time, then he may have opened an old can of bookworms that few could easily refute with any credibility. You see, it's how one says things, it's not what is said. We don't necessarily betray our fortunes to a nihilistic outlook on life when we attempt to fathom the purported falsities of history. Instead, we are left with an interesting set of curiosities regarding the paradox of nothing. In no thing we can find nothing. That's something, isn't it? I presume that Mr Irving's greatest misgiving was that the denial of history had to be normalised for a readership using the older language paradigm of the early 20th century, and was thus seen by many as half-baked in the new postmodern history patterns. Some may say, within this popular culture, that he composed the history in earlier ethnographic terms because he didn't wish to appear anachronistic and was looking for the authenticity of an oral history. He didn't want a Fred Flintstone to dress like George Jetson, vis-a-vis. He wanted a classical view where apples are for apples. We shouldn't mix or intertextualise because it confuses the audience. In a nutshell, I think Mr Irving was guilty of an undue politeness and didn't really see that we can bear fruitful thoughts when we read between the lines and identify the absences and the unsaids of a narrative. In some ways, the mixing of tropes disturbs the surface of historical meanings by challenging a personal sense of conventionality and opening the way for gains in how we perceive the past. We develop insight that promises a likely self-analysis. By viewing the past with the eyes of the present, we are invited, as the historian E.H. Carr oft intimated, we're invited into a futurology of thinking where we can envisage the future and prepare to take best advantage of a promising situation. So in answer to the riddle, how much does a Holocaust or Holocaust? Well, the answer is not much, but you have to dig it yourself. You really have to like it. If you like what I said, why not hit the like button below? It's just below on the YouTube channel. Thanks, it'll give me an idea if I'm getting a response. Cheers. Have a nice day. Salamat, sorry.